try to like do the yeah it should go there then. So yeah, hi everyone. Yeah, today I wanted to present something that I have been delaying this for a while, like for a number of reasons. But I wanted to present something. It's basically a sort of a very compacted version of my master's thesis. So it has but also with some sort of like some of the modifications and the stuff that I have been thinking about. Like I downplayed some of the things that I don't think that make a lot of sense anymore, and also try to sort of like do it in a way that it doesn't sound very annoying for like everybody or very restricted to my own area of research. And yeah, it's mainly like I title it, as you guys could see also in the blurb that I sent, it's Marx, Ecology and Technology. So it's mostly like the main idea that I want to argue about is that if you could read like reading Marx through these two recessive strains within his work, which are always taken as being like marginal interests or things that Marx was not really interested about and are just being retrojected because it's like necessary and so on. But actually like that there are a lot of resources in which these things could be very productively read and weaved into the insights of Marx himself, and that it could also like allow for a new, like an important political reading of our own predicament, as these are like two very important discourses around which like politics are like shaped around. So yeah, so it's basically excerpt of larger effort. I wanted to give a little bit of context on like how did I get to do this particular, like how were these things written and why some of the relations over there are important, and like why did I choose this, because it's a very odd, like it's a lot of odd pairings during the thesis. So I feel like I have to justify why, like why such odd people would be brought together, like and put to talk to each other in a way through text. And like I think that a turning point for me and was really I've read a text by Poston that was published. I think it was one of his last texts published. I think it was in 2018, and it was actually a text about that he was talking about prices and value and yeah, doing his Poston thing and like values, social domination, the same, like the same sort of like sort of rehearsing a very similar argument to what was happening also on time, labor, and social domination. And I remember that there was a point in which there was the question of the climate question got there, and all that there was to be said of the climate question is that it makes the crisis of capital even more urgent. And I was like, man, yeah, that's it then. Like, really, like, is this like do we get, what do we get from like the like all the impact of these like huge bodies of theory that were being produced, not all of them very like some more insightful than others, some more fashionable than others, but like we really get a sort, like I was a little bit like confused by the fact that when we were talking about value and when we were talking about like forms of social domination and so on, the environmental question seemed like a footnote, like a sort of one more thing into the big plot of the whole thing. And it was a feeling that I always had with Poston in particular, but then after that text, I could put it into words because there was like a chance of talking about those things and like saying something about those things. And I felt that there was like, it was always reduced to the level of something very like the sort of the realization that capitalism is bad for the environment, and that of course like a value-based model of production would be a bad thing and unsustainable thing for the environment. So it was very disappointing in that sense. And I always like the Anthropocene was always a topic that I was annoyed about, but also deeply interested. And it was something that in my discipline, it was having a whole different like state of affairs, because most of the people that worked in the Anthropocene, they didn't work with political economy. They worked within like international security, so like geopolitics and security and stuff. And I felt it was a very bad lens through which to look at the problem in a lot of ways, because it always like it ended up with a very old grammar of that just reinstated like nation states and their own little plots of things. Either that, or you ended up with a very like the obverse of it, in which it was just, yeah, let's make, I don't know, forests and other things like subjects of political, like political international legislation, which doesn't work that well also in terms of like particularly within the discipline. And let me just try to move these things around because I cannot like look at my own slides. Yeah, I have to drag them. These like, yeah, perfect. Yeah, and also like how could the statement that value organizes a relationship between humans and nature, which was something that it was implicit already in Marx, and it was implicit already in a lot of the theories that were working on the Anthropocene. Like, what would it really mean to say that, and like what could it connect to like that school and that deeply insightful critique of value, and also like what could it mean to struggle for the abolition of value through that perspective. So like yeah, abolish value, what does abolishing value means for the environment like concretely, and what does it like, what kinds of questions does it pose actually. And yeah, so basically like I worked in 3 chapters, and my dissertation this that you guys will see will be mostly like the second one, which is a sort of like historical cut of some of these things. The first one was just like talking about value and metabolism. The second one was this conceptual figure of like cyber fossil capital is something that could be helpful in order to understand capitalism in the Anthropocene. And the third one was a chapter about alienation in human revisions, which was about the inhuman by Rezan Negrestani, and technology also. And it was sort of like remixing all of these things together. And yeah, if it looks a lot like the workings of a manic person, it's because it, in a way, it was also like I got excited about a lot of things. I like the style also reflects that. So if you read it, you will see like the complete slippage into insanity of someone that is being underpaid by Brazilian government to do research. So it's a great experience. I cannot recommend it. Yeah, so mainly like I was trying to locate Marx and these two like traits of within the body of his work. So the first one was like what do people talk about Marx when they talk about ecology and Marx's views on ecology? And then about that you would have like, I think there are 4 sort of like hegemonic discourses with it sort of like ebbs and flows in a lot of directions, because some of them are actually like have never been hegemonic anywhere apart from their very small cliques, and some of them are more like widespread between the humanities at specific given times. The first one would be energy economics, which I think it's the attempt to actually devise economic models that would work within, particularly within thermodynamics, that have thermodynamics as a huge inspiration for them. I would emphasize on that. There was someone doing that like while Marx was alive, which was Podolinsky. And you also have like people that work trying to retroject this into Marx. I would include here, like there is an influence of energy economics in Emmy Wendling's work, Marx, Technology and Alienation, which is work that I directly engage with in the dissertation, in the thesis. The people on metabolism, which is mainly monthly review people, like it's majorly concentrated within monthly review. And it's made of people like Foster, John Bellamy Foster, Kohei Saito, and I would say also Paul Burkitt does a lot of work into that. Andreas Malm is also someone that would be affiliated with this type of like, with this more or less within that same school, although he's a little bit more like historically oriented than most of these other people, which are more like hardcore Marxology, especially like Saito and Foster. Nature and dialectics, I put this as a sort of as a catch-all category, but who I'm thinking about here is people that actually like try to more or less engage with the idea of a dialectics in nature during their time. This was particularly common during like the 30s and the 40s. You can see, I don't know, Joseph Needham within this sort of tradition. You can see J.D. Bernal, J.B.S. Haldane, like all these people could be like allocated into that, like without that big of a prejudice. And within technology, people that were driving from Marx, they usually came between like from 2 main places. The first one would be media theory. And here we have Matteo Pasquinelli, who I cite, who I quote a lot. Mackenzie Ward was also very like important for me. Alexander Galloway, Tiziana Terranova, Luciana Parisi, all these people would be like fitting into this sort of like media theory side of like a Marxist theory of technology. although the flavor of Marx each of them get is very different. And there is also like a sociological account of Marx and technology, which tries to sort of like grasp these things through, particularly through the Frankfurt School, which I would quote, I don't know, Schatzberg, Andrew Feenberg, and this type of people, like they work within that tradition. And the only things that I knew about like that would be that I would highly want to work with like in my dissertation, I do a critique of the Capitalocene hypothesis. Oh, I forgot to talk about this. So Capitalocene is mainly what the debate environment that it sort of surfaced around, I think, the publications from Jason Moore. Jason Moore was very associated with like the metabolism approach, and then he was drifting apart from them. And he tries to sort of bring energy economics reading of value within like his own work and weave it together with a sort of like, it's not really a flat ontology, but I would say it's much flatter than what the people from the metabolism approach would allow for. But it has become a sort of important thing because they organize a lot of things with like other theories, like they got the attention of Latour, Donna Haraway, so it became a sort of like the Capitalocene, not school, but definitely like a group of intellectuals that are allocated like around that hypothesis, and which is mainly based in a completely different reading of value, which Jason Moore puts forward in his Capitalism and the Web of Life, a book from 2015 that was really important for this type of stuff. And it was good because like this book was particularly important because it got a lot of these people that work within metabolism approaches to actually like fight back, because it got a lot of promotion, it got a lot of hype, and I think this was one of the best things that happened to them in a way, because it popularized other alternatives for dealing with that same thing, especially for the people that were critical of the book in the first place. So yeah, I would locate myself within like what I try to synthesize when I talk about Marx as a thinker of ecology and of technology is a synthesization of metabolism approaches. And I can argue like precisely why I chose these ones a little bit later in the presentation, and media theory approaches, and to bring them together as sort of like a productive friction between Marx's own work. And the thing is that like I started this wanting to be very sort of like having this sort of, oh yeah, I'm doing something, I don't know, that it might not make a lot of sense, but yeah, fuck the Marxology in any way. But then I found out that there is actually a lot of Marxology supporting this type of thing. Like, even though they would not like be in the same room, but there is actually like a lot of textual evidence that these things would actually come together in Marx's thought, and they could be combined, and it could be weaved into political economy in a way that was much easier than just like, than what I thought. And yeah, so basically, like, I think that when we talk about Marx in the Anthropocene, we're fighting about with, I think, what are 5 quick dismissals of Marx. And first is the Marx, the technical determinist. So you have someone saying that actually Marx's thought is limited regarding technology because of that quote from The Poverty of Philosophy, that the hand mill gives you feudal society and so on and so forth. And which is a very like, I'm going to get into that, but then it's a very particular approach. It's a very particular critique that sort of like dismisses the way that the technology could be an object of historical inquiry in Marx, and technology then only becomes something that was interesting because it was economically important. But I don't think that's the case, but we will get to that. Then there's also Marx, the anti-ecological thinker. Like, if you think about value and the privilege of labor power and of human labor power, you can also argue that Marx is actually like neglecting the work of the animal or other strains of work. And it's a common charge also. You can see strains of it that draw from pretty much anywhere. Like, you can find something similar to that, like depending on the reading you do of the Haraway, like you can find this like spread. And the thing with these discourses on the Anthropocene is that they become very much like you often have a thinker that does a very like measured defense of something or a very measured critique of something, and then it just like, because there is a lot of stuff produced about it, like the claims just become more absurd so far as they get being derived. Like, it has this sort of like an echo chamber effect, and then you end up with a Marx that is very different from the source material. And this was something that was like, it was a direct interest for me. And the third one would be Marx, the technical utopian, the techno-utopian actually. And this is something that, like, it's sort of a trope that appeared, I think, after what one could call like the accelerationist hypothesis, that that was actually like because of their particular interpretation of Marx, that Marx was actually like this Promethean techno-utopian guy who was really interested with like just making this sort of like luxury space communism or whatever, and then he just aligned it with Marx and thinks that this is actually like what Marx has to offer in terms of the techno-utopian thing. And this is neither what an accelerationist hypothesis would defend, nor what Marx would do. It's just like something that gets in this echo chamber of the debates about the Anthropocene. The fourth would be Marx's anthropocentrism, which is sort of covered by the anti-ecological part of Marx's thought. And the fifth would be the charges of Prometheanism, which are also very crazy because nobody seems to agree what is being Promethean actually, what does it entail? And like the definitions are very sparse. Like, so you have a defense of Prometheanism that has nothing to do with, like, in Ray Brassier, for instance, and that defense has nothing to do with like the reasons why Prometheanism is attacked by some. And like, you see people from Marxist ecology, they really want to claim that Marx is not a Promethean at all. While you see a very different reading of the myth of Prometheus in media theory, for example, which is highly, like, it's highly influenced by the many different readings of the Promethean myth and so on. So like, there's no agreement into those things. All that we know is that like you get stuck with a sort of a Marx that comes from this echo chamber of the debate. And like, this is where I wanted to intervene at the time. Yeah, so mainly like the two concepts that got me interested into these two approaches on media theory and on ecology, like that is the metabolism approach and the media theory approach to technology within Marxist reading, were the concept of metabolism in ecology, which I found to be like that it was a concept that was able to actually account neither for a subsumption of the human as that natural thing, but still keep the specificity of the social as a sphere, which was something that was like, it didn't have to naturalize a value production, for instance, as people from the Capitalocene approach usually do. And in terms of technology, the concept of modulation was particularly important for me. And because it was something that through readings of Babbage, for instance, you can see that there is the interest in technology becomes not only an interest in like in an economic category, but in a social category, like with a very broad meaning. And like expanding this meaning of technology was something that was interesting for me when reading Marx and when reading Marx's remarks on technology. And for me, weaving like ecology and technology together, like within, like in the way that they were, like apart from the way that they were usually separate when reading Marx's work, would be something that could be done like through these two concepts. They could like get to a good agreement on that. And
could I ask a quick question really quick?
Yeah, sure.
Just to clarify, if you can go back, what you're meaning by metabolism here? You're saying like for whole ecology, is it somehow like,
yeah, no, I'm gonna
the ability for an environment to like process changes to it or something like that?
Yeah, no, I'm gonna go to the McKinsey work thing. I think there are two interesting accounts of metabolism within Marxism. Like it's sort of two ways to approach the matter of the exchange. I would say the way that social forms unfold themselves through natural means or through like material objects. I would emphasize McKinsey work first, and which is a sort of more vulgar definition, I would say, and then perhaps we could get to Saito's definition of it. So basically, this is a good quote by Wark. She says that labor pounds and widows rocks and soil, plants and animals, extracting the molecular flows out of which our shared life is made and remade. But these molecular flows do not return from whence they came. Marx's example of a metabolic rift was the way 19th century English farming extracted nutrients such as nitrates from the soil, which growing plants absorbed, which farmers harvested as crops, which workers in the cities ate to fuel their industrial labors, and who would then shit and piss the waste of the product of their private metabolisms. The Anthropocene is a series of metabolic rifts, where one molecule after another is extracted by labor and technique to make things for humans, but the waste products don't return so that the cycle can renew itself. And I think that this sort of starts covering a long genealogy of the environmental question in Marx. And you can see that, like, for example, this particular insight, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's in Capital, actually, when he talks about like the relocations between the fields and the city. There is something like a passing note about this on the manuscripts also, when he talks about land rent, and when he mentions very briefly the rural exodus in like in the English countryside. And there is also like, it also weaves together some like previous Marxist previous texts, like journalistic accounts. I think there is a particular text about a winery in his hometown. I think it's one of the first ones to be published. That was also like about a similar issue. So that a similar kind of degrading of the land through agriculture. And of course, like this is a very vulgar account of metabolism that could go, and that basically talks about like the material flows of like nutrients and energy and labor that are weaved through the economy, and that may end up being the cause of anthropic effects at a very large scale. And this is a much more formal definition of metabolism in Marx, which is what Saito advances through his reading of metabolism. And I think that the catch with Saito is that instead of McKinsey work is very concerned with seeing metabolism as a metaphor, and like as a sort of metaphor that becomes literal through economic activity. And but then she's not that concerned with how to weave actually that kind of concept of metabolism back into Marx's own work. She's very like the term that she uses like in her book is détournement, which is like from leaderboard, which is basically like a sort of a non-filiation, like a reproduction of already existing intellectual ideas from someone without actually this sort of like affiliation. So she's sort of like remixing Marx, if one claims, but actually there is a highly like what Kohei Saito argues is that there is a regularity of the idea of metabolism as an important idea within Marx's work, which gets which becomes more evident precisely when Marx starts getting in contact with Justus von Liebig's work on land chemistry. But it also has deep implications for how other questions within Marx are read. And this is a really, like, I highly recommend everybody reading this, like this book by Saito. It's a really interesting approach overall. But basically what he says is that metabolism, so Stoffwechsel, in the sense takes place as changes of different commodities through their exchanges, and Formwechsel between money and commodity occurs at the same time. So basically he sees two concepts of metabolism within Marx. So you see one concept of like the change of forms through the production of value. So for example, when you have M, C, M, M plus, and like when you have that sort of trajectory, you're talking about Formwechsel, but these Formwechsel only can happen through Stoffwechsel as the material flows that are taken for the production and consumption of these commodities. And what he says is that Stoffwechsel proceeds within the sphere of circulation when necessary use values are distributed among private producers, similar to the way blood provides each organ with necessary nutrients. Of course, in that specifically place, we can get a very good memory of Bogdanov, a very warm friend of ours. And in this usage, Marx usually adds the adjective social. Insofar as the process of exchange transfer commodities from hands in which they are non-use values to hands in which they are use values, it is a process of social metabolism. We therefore have to consider the whole process in its formal aspect, that is to say, the change in form or the metamorphosis of commodities through which the social metabolism is mediated. And this juxtaposition of Formwechsel and Stoffwechsel in Capital also indicates Marx's original methodological approach to treat the objects of his investigation from both material, stofflich, and formal aspects. So I think in this quote, what Saito's trying to argue is actually like, it's about the fact that in each of the inflections of these economic forms, so when we talk about like already, be it like the reproduction of value, like one has to bear into mind that you have these two parallel mechanisms, and that like what is actually like a commodity flow or a value flow or like a flow of production, and the circuit of production is entirely built into another circuit of like in a circuit of environmental and elemental exchange that needs to be taken account of, and that while that is the material support through which these forms actually reproduce themselves, one can actually, like Marx's object is not to say that there is like a full legislation of the social through the nature, but actually that analyzing the social means taking these objects in these two, like through these two perspectives at the same time. And I think that this can have like this can have a lot of like fertile consequences for how one reads Marx so far. And the book, of course, extensively argues about it. Like you have this, I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, but from now, I think another thing that I wanted to highlight was about the connection between Saito and Tenochtitlan, which I think Dennis mentioned in the previous class. There is like I was talking about this like earlier today, but there is a deep connection between actually the way Saito interprets Marx and the way that a particular interpretation of Marx in the context of Japanese Marxism was actually like set together. And it is like that Saito is doing his interpretation based on the obverse, like on a debate that was between Samezo Kuruma and Kozo Uno about the question of money. And while the debate was about the question of money, you have a lot of like one of the particular points of contention between them, and like one of the things that marked Kuruma's approach was the fact that he was, and it's something that I think it was reflected even in Dennis's presentation about that was mentioned when Otani was mentioned, was that Otani's theory has actually like a huge one of the important things for Otani's theory is that actually the labor that produces commodities is like the metabolism of like the labor that produces commodities is actually private, in the sense that like there is a disconnection between the moment of the production decision and the moment of consumption. And in this temporal disconnection, there is a sort of like that mortal leap of the commodity is mediated, and the fact that the labor is organized through abstract labor means that this labor is like highly privatized and bought by different people through different like production decisions. So this is something that has it has a huge impact on how Saito will make his argument about value as such. I don't want to get too nitty-gritty in the details about like how Saito exactly interprets value, but I think I thought it was a good thing to mention that there is this relationship between these two things that we talked about. Let me just drag some of this thing. Yeah, and the second thing is actually like the charges of technodeterminism, which I think are one of the most important parts of what Marx, what is said about Marx's approach to technology. And I think that there is a sort of attempt of making Marx an actually like far less.
Sorry,
yeah.
Somebody needs to mute. Somebody needs to mute.
What? I don't understand. Is there being like feedback? Just 1 second.
Yeah, somebody said that someone else had to mute their microphones, but then it went really quiet. So I guess that issue was solved.
Sorry about that. Never mind.
Modality.
Raphael, I think you're muted now, no?
What?
Yeah, I made myself speak. Nice. That's great.
There you go.
Yeah, that's good. Let me try to get back to it. It just fucked everything up. Okay, I'm just gonna share it again. I think it's at this point it's gonna be easier. Okay, 1 second. Yeah, okay, we're back. Good. Yeah, so mainly like one of the other things also that I wanted to emphasize was the way in which like the charges against technodeterminism and Marx are actually like they are actually far more overstretched than what they can be. And usually the quote is the same. So the hand mill gives you a society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalism. And it's always portrayed in the sense that like, okay, Marx is saying that there is a neat techno-determinist trajectory in which like the technical development is done. And then that technical development brings about this change into like a social sphere. But then, of course, like this is a highly, like it's the second most decontextualized thing in the poverty of philosophy. I think the first one are the comments on like slavery that he has, which are like definitely the top one most decontextualized thing in that book. But one of the interesting things, in fact, about the way that Marx was encountering his own intellectual environment at his time was the fact that during the, like it is quite documented in his own like writings and so on and so forth, that during the time in which Marx was writing The Poverty of Philosophy, one of the main texts which he was approaching was actually Babbage's own work on machines. And like he was actually, there were not only like a lot of notes within the headlines of Babbage's book, but actually side notes which actually were exchanged between him and Engels for a lot of the times. And what is actually at stake in Marx's quotation and Marx's debate with Proudhon is not necessarily the fact that what the machine determines about the social, but is actually what does that machine represent in a lot of ways. And that representation is that whether is the machine a resolution of the division of labor, which was the position that was held by Proudhon at the time, which Marx was trying to argue, or is it a condensation of an already existing social condition that was of the existing division of labor. And yeah, you can see this thread being developed in Marx's work in a lot of times. Like you see a return to the question of technology, for instance, like very directly faced in the fragment on machines in the Grundrisse. And of course, the most famous quote from that would be that the development of fixed capital indicates to what degree general social knowledge has become a direct force of production. And to what degree, hence, the conditions of the process of social life itself have come under the control of the general intellect and been transformed in accordance with it. To what degree the powers of social production have been produced, not only in the form of knowledge, but also as immediate organs of social practice, of the real life process. And this is also a quote that has been like, this has been a text that has been like highly debated in a lot of ways. Like it's a text, for instance, that is very important for like the accelerationism in a more contemporary like vibe. It's also a very important text for Italian operaismo, for instance, because the concept of the general intellect becomes very, very, very important for them. Also, the emphasis on technology as such and changes of factory layout for the like operary inquiry groups of like the more sociologically inclined people within the Italian theorists. But there is an interesting thing about this process in particular, because not only you can see that there is like you can see already like a development from what was being put over there, because here already in Marx can see that there is this division of labor as such is this division between intellectual and manual labor. But at the same time, like the diagnosis of the general intellect is something that appears only once in his work, and that has been the source of huge speculation. Some people like talk about, I think it's Virno that has a whole book about this, I think tracing it back to Aristotle or something. Like there are huge contentions about this also, like in Negri's work about like what would be the source of the general intellect. And it's very interesting that it's a text that only appears once, like it's a term that only appears once, but it becomes like this huge thing because it appears as something that can solve the approach to machines that we face, like the problems we face with technology. And there's a quote by Virno in which he talks about like that, like this particular, like the fragment on machines in the Grundrisse is just the same as if you compare to the Bible in a Western movie, that it's always like in times of probation, in times of hardship, you just have to look at the Bible and you derive some sort of wisdom from it, and then finally you're going to be saved. And I think this is a very interesting like interpretation of that phenomena, because this like particularly for the recurrence of these ideas and which are always trying to supplement the fact that like, oh, Marx like sort of like undermine this initial dismissal of Marx as a techno-determinist. And there is also like a lot of archival work done on what Ruth Roth, for instance, is a theorist. Like she works at, she's working at the MACVA. I think she's closely affiliated with Michael Heinrich on that. And she talks that Marx actually like he approached the question of machines as a threefold question. So the machine as a change in daily life of the workers, like in the daily factory ground work life, the machine and the macroeconomical effects that machinery can have. So of course, like what we have as the tendency at the composition of capital, and all these insights are closely related to it. But also there is the like what she calls the machine as a matrix reflecting the division of labor. So like how could the machine actually become an index, like a sort of important artifact from which one can derive and understand the division of labor that is at place. And that puts the machine not only like as a determinant thing that answers the question. So like the question of a feudal society is actually answered by the kind of technology that it uses, but it actually flips the question around, that in fact, that particular machine belonging to something can become a diagram of inquiry of that particular society and the division of labor that it takes. And and perhaps this kind of like taking the matrix, like that the machine is the matrix that reflects the division of labor, while at the same time understanding that the machine is what mediates the metabolism of production and is what splits labor into its own parts and animates the flash stack enmeshment of capital, is precisely treating the machine between the material and the formal, which Saito was arguing was the approach that was taken by Marx in all the investigations of his objects and throughout his work. And it's interesting that there is this is sort of a bit of trivia on Marx about how the general intellect comes to become this metaphor. And Pasquinelli has this very, the article is called On the General Intellect, and he talks about the way in which, in fact, the general intellect doesn't refer to Aristotle, it doesn't refer to like a deeper plot within Marxist thought, but it actually refers to the public debate at the time, which was the debate on the March of Intellect. And this is an image from a newspaper around like just about the same time when Marx was alive, and a newspaper that Marx was actually like subscribing from. And of course, this is all like delicious trivia speculation, but I think it makes some sense actually when we talk about it. And what Marx was actually like, the March of Intellect was like it was made in tandem with a lot of opposition from factory workers about acquiring technical skills for operating the machinery. And it was believed that actually like acquiring these technical skills would actually be gain from them. And it was like, you can see that like right at the corner here, I don't know if you like on the right corner, like you see a justice being like sort of like laying down, like this figure of justice being laid down with the harp and the sword all over her, and her breasts are like showing. And then she's asking the March of Intellect, which is basically like it has a sort of a university building on top, books on history, philosophy, chemistry, and of course the whole delicious reference to thermodynamics, saying that it's coming to deliver justice after all. And there was this, and like in the context of a fight in which what was being fought was actually for the diffusion of knowledge in the space of the factory, it's very interesting that Marx, the one that was interested in technology on all of these aspects, would actually choose the metaphor of the general intellect when he was talking about like on the fragment of machines, about the effects of machinery. And there is an interesting thing though, that like, if this is only a piece, like this could be an argument in the direction that like, okay, the general intellect is just a piece of like a piece of argument that doesn't really, like it's just a mere conjunctural analysis from Marx. So like it doesn't matter a lot. That's why it doesn't appear in Capital. But it would be rather strange because it seems like a very important category in the Grundrisse. Like it seems to be the category that stands for the penetration of science within the productive process. And this is not a discussion that is confined to the Grundrisse, of course, it's a deep discussion in Capital. So why the term disappears is the question that like Pasquinelli asks, I think. And in fact, what he sees is that, and this is supported by Like this is also a very nitty-gritty archival work. And as I said in the beginning, I thought I would do something that was like, yeah, fuck archival support and Marx's work, fuck the Marxology and so on. But actually, like I found out that it was actually quite like bland from that perspective. there was nothing that surprising about finding these things out or making these connections. And they seemed like rather trivial in the long run and rather like possible at least. And yeah, when there is an interesting evolution in Marx about the collective worker, which was the evolution on how the relationship that was expressed by the general intellect, that is the relationship between technology and labor, so between intellectual and manual labor as well, passes through capital and becomes this other like different concept in that time. And basically the main question over here is like, how does knowledge shape the division of labor? And while in the general intellect, you see that the metaphor is actually like you have knowledge and it's very knowledge becoming the organ of production. But then on the collective worker, you have in fact, the relation is reversed. Like you have the fact that labor becomes the source of this type of formalized knowledge by the scientist, by the engineer, by the inventor. So what could that be, right? And this has become like, this is sort of the crusade of Pasquinelli's whole like endeavor into work. And I'm very interested in this. And he says that like there is, I'm quoting directly Pasquinelli on that. He recognizes not that there is a knowledge shaping production, but the mutual relationship set between knowledge and production, which only comes as an incorporation of Babbage's work from 1832, claiming that workshops contain a rich mine of knowledge, often neglected by the wealthier classes, and that the process of labor as such is predicated on energy and knowledge, or as we will call information. And this is a very interesting, tricky thing that Pasquinelli does, and like we will get back to it. But then this becomes a sort of a way to also talk about like this proto-cybernetics of capital in Marx. And that the proto-cybernetics of capital is not only like something that Marx, as a lot of the as some of the theorists might argue, that comes from thermodynamics and from the thermostat and like the operation of the engine. There is also like that line of thought, but in fact it comes from what is called modulation in Babbage's thought, and like this sort of modulation, which is the split of how he conceptualizes the machine. And we will get to Babbage in a second. So when we get to Babbage, we talk like the machine, and the machine for Marx actually, it talks about like to the 3 steps of the machine. So you have the motion force of that machine. So you have the energy source, which can be like coal, for instance, or oil or whatever. And you have the fact like of that division of labor, which is, yeah, I mix, this got mixed actually, like where you read like this motion force part, it's a mechanism of transfer. And then you have the modulation side, which is what he gets from Babbage, which is in the fact that like the micro actions that get tracked into the productive process. So like the micro decisions by the worker through which he can actually like make that motion force that moves that mechanism, that moves that mechanism, and then he can operate that machine. So mainly, like there are 2 main things that are seen to be highly modified within the concept of the collective worker, and that were not in the concept of the general intellect, like in Marx, which are the concept of like the question of energy, so like the motion of machines. And there is, of course, like in Fragment of Machines, he talks about like there is a sort of like technophilia that is highly evident when he talks about like the self-moving automaton and this type of thing. And which is also a historical image, like in Great Britain, right? You have like a lot of spectacles about automata since, you know, the 1700s. They're a very common thing, but like you have shows of self-moving machines in which like behind the curtain you have like a horse pulling that mechanism. So it's a very common image for like Victorian culture at the time. And modulation then for Babbage becomes the way in which like that motion force that gets that is like attenuated into the machine becomes actually like embedded with the knowledge of the person operating it. And the rich mine of knowledge then is precisely the knowledge of that operator. And so that micro decision, that micro movement, that even though it seems very mechanical, it informs the process of formalization of that and informs the process of planning into that. And Pasquinelli will get to that, and I will get into that also. But like what we have so far here is, it's the very interesting, like if you go to Simondon, for instance, like Simondon has a very interesting thought about in the industrial modality, which he calls, which is that the industrial modality appears when the source of information and the source of energy separate. And if we look at the way that Marx is talking about like these three steps within the machine, and also the way that Babbage is talking about about modulation, and you can see that this separation of the industrial apparatus is, of course, the separation that is retrojected into the division of labor and that the machine crystallizes. And namely, when the human being is merely the source of information and nature is required to furnish the energy. I will get to how nature furnishes that energy in a bit. And the machine is different from the tool in that it is a relay. So instead of like, while the tool sort of like, and Simondon can be like, of course, you can charge Simondon with this nostalgia for the workshop, for the ancient workshop and so on and so forth. But like what he talks about the machine, the difference between the machine and the tool is that the machine is actually a relay. So it has two different entry points in which like progressively more there is an entry point of solely energy, and progressively more there is an entry point of solely information through the labor activity. And that information is what informs the collective worker and the machine structure of capital, the machine infrastructure of capital, not necessarily whatever the general intellect inflects into society in a way. Gabriel, go.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to perhaps make a counterpoint because it's an interesting way. I'm totally with Pasquinelli when he refocuses the discussion from that very short page where Marx uses this word in manuscript to a very central concept in Capital, which is collective labor. But what I find weird in this shift, I'm not sure if you're emphasizing it because of your interest in machines, or if Pasquinelli himself is emphasizing it, which is that we've discussed this a lot, and it's quite important to the theory of abstraction that we're ultimately developing here, I think, because the biggest difference that I see between collective labor and general intellect is that you can have the same structure without machines. Collective labor is a concept that is much larger in scope. It includes, it's introduced in the concept in the chapter on cooperation. It's not introduced in the chapter on modern industry, right? The whole point is that the powers of the collective laborer are freely available to the capitalist, while each individual laborer only sold their private labor, therefore is only due to him the payment for that private commodity. So, and at that moment, we already have the disjunction between information and energy, because who decides what to do with this collective power of the collective labor is the capitalist. So energy comes from the laborer, information comes from valorization. So you don't need machines to play such a huge kind of spectacular role. And it becomes clearer that you previously need to have the logic at play before it can, let's say, be sedimented into objective spirit, right? I mean, part of the reason why workers don't relate to their own collective is that this collective only exists as a sort of, it doesn't appear, right? Because it's not commodified, therefore it doesn't appear in the commodity world. Capitalists didn't pay for collective labor, right? But the moment that the relations that establish the collective labor are embodied in a machine, right? And that's why you need the manufacture phase. Because in manufacture, you start to behave machine-like, even though still there are no machines. Once the relations are kind of mechanical in a way, the relations, parts and wholes of actions, then you can come up with a mechanical device that embodies those relations. So, as you said, like machines come at the end of once you have the theory of the collective laborer, machines can come at the end of this process, and let's say make the collective laborer appear in fixed capital, right? But you don't need to associate it, or don't even need the reference to machines to talk about collective laborers, or to talk about the disjunction between information and energy. right? You can actually,
Yeah.
That's even a definition in chapter, I mean, in Portuguese is chapter 4, when he introduces the difference between the labor process from the point of, no, chapter 7, point of view of labor, point of view of valorization. And he says, yeah, the difference is that laborers don't get to choose how they spend their energy, right? That's a definition of rupture between information and energy. So I think it's useful to add that point, because otherwise it looks like there's a difference between machines making this process appear as a commodity, right? They give a commodity form to that process, right? And the collective labor, let's say, as a general concept in capital, which actually covers more than that, right?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. I think you're absolutely right into pointing this out, because I think that like the best way to actually look at these claims, and I think that this is something that, because Pasquinelli is interested in smuggling something else in, which I'm going to talk about, which is his conception of algorithms as being always like labor produced, which is an entirely different point from like, it drifts very much far away from like what Marx could and could not do in a way. And about the Simondon quote, this one thing, it's there is a quote like that in the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, but I think that this particular one, if I'm not mistaken, is on it's in an interview that he gives, that he goes through, like he does this division in like the sort of two things. So the workshop, the industrial apparatus, and then after the workshop he goes to the electricity as this big other thing, which I also follow. But I can try to locate that one. It's a good interview. But anyway, like the thing that I find, and I think that we have to submit the concept of the collective laborer to the same kind of generality that Saito submits the concept of abstract labor, in the sense that like abstract labor takes a particular private form in capital, and it has a particular, not exactly private in the case of collective labor, but it takes a particular form in capital. But it doesn't mean that you cannot retroject and use that concept as a tool for understanding the following divisions in different historical contexts of between manual and intellectual labor. This, I think, like absolutely needs to be done. I think that what might happen between the concept of the collective labor is that something appears through this dismantling of the work within the worker process. And I think that there is like, this is something that I take that the machine is important for that, not necessarily because the machine is what inaugurates it, but the machine is sort of like this cultural object that in Victorian culture makes this work of like the disorientation of the human as something. And I take it here, like for instance, I think Daniel McNally has this book about monsters, in which he talks about like the dismantling of the body, which is something that like starts at the plantation and then goes until like you have in the Industrial Revolution, you have like this sort of like the mightiness of steam, which is I think there are two myths that are torn down by Industrial Revolution. The first one would be the myth of strength, which is torn down like the individuality of human labor as this particular like skillful thing that it can only like this particular strong thing that can produce novelty. So like we can have a machine producing, like at least automating a little bit of this task. So the individuality of labor as this sort of like cosmic thing like disappears. Of course, it reappears. Like if you look at like the particularity of capitalist production, it appears again in its twisted form. But then also like the myth of skill, which becomes eroded with the concept of information, and with the way in which like information starts formalizing these micro decisions of knowledge. And I think that these make the collective worker more evident. But I agree with you that like if we look at like other forms of like social organization, you can definitely find like the collective worker lurking.
Yeah, but just to make a clarification, like my point is not that in other forms other than capitalist. I mean, my remark was absolutely about capitalism. Like, it's not about like, let's take it to a previous era, even though you probably could talk about it, right? The reason why I say this is just because, I mean, you know this because we discussed this in your like the exam day, but I find that there is a programmatic reason to focus. I mean, not you, but some of the authors you're following, they have a programmatic reason to focus on machines,
Yeah.
One accepted and one that I don't think it's recognized. The accepted one is that they do prefer to face alienation between subjective and objective than alienation between parts of the working class. Like they think it's more heroic, Promethean to learn to talk to a machine than to learn to talk to your neighbor. So there is a poetics around the sort of politics they want to push, about technology and so on. And the second, which is they are the middle class that sits in front of computers every day. So it doesn't surprise me that they think this is the big, that's where the core of the debate is. But so I always find it useful to kind of just step back, because even though the debates are so interesting, there's so much in that, sometimes it seems like you're invited to forget that, social relations precede their objectification in a certain mechanical form or some form of automation and so on, right? And when you forget that, for example, you might end up forgetting that none of these automations through information have allowed workers not to have zeal during the work and to adapt, platforms, automated things to the actual implementation, which still takes even more invisible forms of knowledge, so it doesn't take that away.
Yeah, no, I totally, I think that like, I might give this seems like a good opportunity for this. So I'm gonna give my 2 cents on like this, like on these, like some of these tendencies within like accelerationism and its relationship to the technical object. I think that there is something, which is the fact that there is not really a cohesive, and in this I think Mackenzie Walker is really right when she writes Celerity, which was the critique of like the accelerationist manifesto and so on, that accelerationism is in a lot of ways a tactic that is mistaken for a strategy. And I think that this is like, I approach accelerationism as a possible tactic, which is something that actually like the people involved in it have been trying to make that same point. So for example, like you see Nick Cernicek trying to like blend in like the workers movement for like app workers in London, for instance. Like you can see that like the previous shift to like platform capitalism, I think that like it's very telling of that. I think it comes to be this realization that this aesthetic affinity doesn't really translate into mobilization and into the kind of hegemony which was the first strategy, which means I think a change in the strategy and like not a dismissal, but I think a sort of downplaying of what you can do with actual hegemony theory, like from their side. Like this is what I think that it's cooking over there right now, like at least from what I see, like from these people that I follow. But yeah, I think that I totally agree with your point about like the collective worker. I just think that like the machine flashes, for me the machine is important because I want to see the machine as a diagram from which you can not perhaps derive, but like becomes a very interesting cognitive map for other forms of domination that are outside of the factory as such. So it's a way of making the of seeing organizational shapes without having to rely in the sort of like argument about the extended factory, for example, like which is in which everything becomes more and more a factory and so on. But like actually you can see that in actuality, in historical actuality, and this for me is important, that you can see these diagrams being passed from one place to the other, and like they are not just like some coincidences of things circulating, but they actually have this like sort of like you can drive a little bit of those paranoia like lines between them, and it looks nice. So that's pretty much like I think my interest in technology comes from that, like not necessarily from like a sort of like a privileged thing, but it's definitely an object that I privilege because I really like studying it. So
plus, I mean, they do drink more oil than we do, right? So I guess.
Yeah, I mean
that's reason enough, I guess.
Yeah, Yeah, we will get to oil. We will get to oil. But so mainly like what appears within the collective worker is the machine as the historical object in the one hand, which illustrates a certain diagram of social domination, and as a relay of material flows of energy and information. And this, like in particular on the industrial modality, you see that the relay is between energy and information. And so sort of doing like an insane recap of things that were not actually fully said. Uh, mainly what do we have, what is Marx's chart over there about this, like about this question that might bring metabolism and machines together? So there are I think three main informations of Marx from these sort of like empirical / scientific / current sciences of his time that were actually important for like the developments of theory. I think the first one would be thermodynamics, which I like, at least in my reading, it's less important than people try to make it. And the theory of machines, which I hope to show it's a little bit more important than people try to make for Marx, and agricultural sciences, which I try to show that it's a little bit more important than Marx was for Marx, and it was actually like defended. So this is sort of my 2 cents about this. About like thermodynamics in particular. So we see this both in Marx's like in Sadi Carnot's reading, in Marx's reading of Sadi Carnot during his lifetime. Also his debate with Podolinsky, which is highly interesting. His letter to Engels about the second law of thermodynamics, which is very important for like what they are doing, how they're trying to approach like very ontological questions in a lot of ways. And right when Engels was writing Dialectics of Nature, the theory of machines, which I think brings together a very interesting lineage, which gets fictionalized a lot, which is the lineage between Charles Babbage's the difference engine and the analytical engine, and also how far these predate or like pre-announce Alan Turing's own work later, which I think forms an interesting thread for us to follow, particularly for when we leave the Industrial Revolution. And Justus von Liebig, which is mainly the question of the synthesizing of nitrogen on as a way of healing the metabolic rift within like high scale land production, which was always also geared towards like particularly cotton fields in his work, which of course we're talking about like Indian colonization, textile hegemony of Brittany, of England, and so on and so forth. And so thermodynamic becomes this particularly important thing for the concept, and this is something that Amy Wendling argues, that labor power is a concept that can come to be fleshed out through thermodynamics, and the theory of machines becomes an important thing and particularly Babbage's work on the machine becomes this particular avenue to which to grasp relative surplus value, and also for the composition of capital and these other like concepts that will be like developed within capital, and agricultural sciences as this thing through which you can talk both about the metabolic rift as the occurrence of disequilibrium. I don't like to use the word disequilibrium, but let's say like this temporary imbalance of nutrients within soil through anthropic activity. And I think that what becomes the stake now, if we see that these things are connected within the work, and that a lot of these things actually happen and like in relationship to one another, like you can sort of set what kind of role these theories have for Marx. And I think that there are 2 main readings of that. Saito has a discussion of Wendling. Wendling doesn't have a discussion of Saito because it's a much earlier book. But it's a very interesting that I think that they too, each of them has actually something to say about these influences, even if they disagree to the extent. Like Amy Wendling is 100% focused on thermodynamics, and Saito is actually 100% focused on agricultural sciences. Right? Like they make very little of the theory of machines. Saito a little bit more. Wendling is more focused on like the machine being reviewed through thermodynamics. So they have this sort of qualm between them. but still, I think that each of them, they actually put a certain like method of reading. So Wendling is interested in aligning Marx with scientific materialists from his time, and like sort of justifying some sort of like Marxist needs to actually like further this metaphor, and also like to approach problems of science in a very weird way. And Saito's work is actually like more concerned with how the concept of metabolism actually reveals something about Marx's own procedures for reading in general. And I think that basically I would rather stay with Saito in this sense, because I think that like these things are being read not necessarily as some, and this is something that gets evident through more communication between Marx and Engels, that thermodynamics is it's not read necessarily as revelation, but it's read in fact as something like as a question, as posing a question for the current mode of production, but both as it like is the obvious means through which like it formalizes a certain quality of exchangeability of labor, but also it becomes the engine as such of the Industrial Revolution. But it's not necessarily something that I think has any impact on like Marx's scientific character of Marx's work in that in that regard. So I would rather read these things as much more as like models with which one can think with, rather than actually just like a sort of something that makes Marx's thought scientific or not, which is the avenue that some of these theories would go. And yeah, so we get there is a good bit on Marx and technology in Wark's last book. I think it's on Capital, not the last one. She launches a lot of books. It's the 2019 one, which is Capital is Dead. And she makes the point actually after she makes a whole book about like the theory of metabolism and so on, that like between this relationship between the human and natures, and between like these two categories of like lies, technology in a particular sense as this thing that is made of nature and remakes both the human and nature at the same time. So like she sort of tries to integrate the way in which like this approximation that she makes, like it's a sort of metaphoric approximation between metabolism and technology as such. And oh my God, I'm talking a lot. I just realized. And then she tries to actually like put this point further into that. And I don't know, do you guys think that like, should I stop? Should I finish? What should I do? Because I feel like I've talked a lot. I don't know if you guys have questions, and if it's productive just to like sprint to the end, or just like talk a little bit. I don't know. Let me see how many slides I have left. Fuck me. Oh yeah, I have like 10. Fuck, okay. Yeah, I'll just, yeah.
Yeah, I think you can keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, and then on that vein of the relationship between metabolism and machines also, you see this very interesting text. It's the text that I sent you guys about Pasquinelli's work, which he calls the reading of the trajectory of machines through the diversion of their flow. So like, how do we actually talk about, and this is something that he, and the main task that he has within the text is actually trying to weave together the what one could call this like technological critique of like current contemporary capitalism with this Anthropocene as an important paradigm for like formulating politics and so on and so forth. And what I get from that text particularly is first, so that it is an attempt of tracing alternative plots to how machines are approached within Marx, which means what I was saying before, like the machine appearing as a diagram in which flows are diverted, and in which you can know something about the, like through looking at a certain paradigmatic machine, and also through very specific machines, if you want to like downscale the level of, like to go to a further level of specificity, you can trace a sort of an alternative plot of succession between different paradigms, and it might reveal something about these paradigms that looking at them from another perspective would not reveal necessarily. And it definitely can reveal something about the relationship between metabolism and the way it's mediated by technology, but I think it also brings the possibility of bringing together a struggle against like labor struggles with, like, it can be a useful cognitive mapping through which labor struggles can be mapped together with environmental struggles through the flows of, like, through the material flows that each of them are predicated on, and through those two predicates, like both the formal and the material aspect. And it's also something like I had this was all geared by a very particular thing on my thesis, which was to address a kind of thought that tries to make technology something that is a unique trajectory. So for instance, like the unfolding of Western technology is about one particular view of matter. And I think that this is very poor from the perspective of, like, if you look at it from the perspective of political economy, it's just like, yeah, it doesn't tell you much, you know, about anything. And it just becomes like this sort of like, and it may serve to weave technology within the plot of philosophy, but it doesn't serve to weave technology into much else, at least like in how I see it. So I think that an approach that can actually take these particular machines and see their metabolic imprints can be useful into that. So it can have this, like, it can be helpful in mapping. And like these paradigmatic machines allow also for a sort of like synthetic history on particular like important events in political economy. And they might also serve as diagrams of power that can see how ways of organization can can sort of transition between modes A, B, and C. And this is something that I think that might reveal something like when like how some ways of organizing and some ways of exercising power travel from like particular spaces like between other spaces, and like extraction of information traveling from the like confined within the factory space to another like empirical space. That might be something interesting to pursue in a way. And yeah, I think I'm just gonna jump, Mom. I'm so sorry. I love to talk about oil, but I think that this will take us somewhere else. But mainly, like, what I'm arguing about here is that, like, I'm trying to make a trajectory of like of three main eventual sort of like events that could be actually traced within these paradigmatic machines. And then when we talk about like Andres Malm has a very particular historiographical record of how come the thermodynamic engine becomes the driving force of the Industrial Revolution. And the main thing is that, like, the usual history that one hears about it is that, like, it became more effective than water mills constantly. But then if you look at the data from that time, like how actually more productive, like in terms of numbers, these water-based engines were versus like if you look at the same at the same time how a steam engine would work during the same period, you see that actually that's not true. Like there's no like the productivity of the water engine is actually far like it's actually far bigger. And not the productivity, sorry, but actually like the potency of those machines can actually like translate into can be much more like easily applied. But what he finds out is that actually the main reason for the unfolding of this plot of like a fossil fuel based industrial economy is the fact that it are some of the qualities that these that fossil fuels bring into the productive process that a water mill cannot bring. And this is highly embedded with his study of the struggle of both coal miners and also like industrial workers in the countryside of England, which then becomes the reason why like fossil fuels are actually seen over as better than water mills, mainly because you can actually take them to bigger cities with bigger pools of labor, and you can actually like you cut the bargaining power of these people, and you can also like maintain the spread danger of miners, of workers to actually like form a coalition with industrial workers at bay, because you put the mines in the like in those very like minefield cities that are like a little bit apart from everything else, and then you have this geographical distance between them and the industrial capitals, in which like these processes would be unfolding, and in which you could have actually exercise power over labor, and the fact that these machines would like you would actually allow for a exact like in the river, for instance, like you would have a diminution of the flows given like natural resources, while with coal you could actually like calculate your inputs precisely. So like you have the modulation of the quantities of the industrial process like very clearly set from the beginning. And this is something that he relates to the
That's about the metabolic imprint of machines that you mentioned before. Would that be something like, I guess, going with Saito's definition of the metabolism before? Would it be something like the sum of like, I guess, the use values in and out of the machine plus like I guess we call them like externalities, right? Something like that? Or
what do you mean, like in terms of like the quantification of metabolism?
Maybe just in terms of, I guess, localizing it for a specific machine. That's what I've been trying to wrap my head around about what you mean by like the metabolic imprint of a particular machine, right?
Yeah. Here I'm dealing with mostly like the a sort of like abstract vision of like any machine that would be powered by coal, for instance. So particularly like it doesn't particularly address one machine, but then if you would take that, then you would probably be talking about at least what Malm would do, and he talks about like mainly carbon as the byproduct, or as the byproduct of valorization process. So you sort of see like he would put carbon as this remainder within that process of the production of a commodity, and I think he would be measuring in that sense. But his work is again like highly historical, and was mainly on like unveiling like the specific movements of that, at least in that particular piece that I'm referencing. I'm not sure how he would deal with that, like econometrically, for instance, like in the case of the firm. And I would say that probably they would go with something that energy economics, similar to what energy economists would do, but perhaps much more focused on like the outcome of the process through CO2 than actually like the inflows of like the material inflows, and the focus on like thermodynamics that you would see. But I'm not sure what they would do.
So is the importance of fossil capital, does it it seems to me that there's something key to the fact that it was like produced long ago, right? Not by us, but it's, I guess, just the dead bodies of organisms, and we're also kind of displacing something towards the future, right? So we're almost stealing from the past and the future for the I don't know if that's like along the right lines or
no. That's I think that one of the things that they want to argue is that like the natural qualities of oil become overly adequate, or of like fossil fuels in general become overly adequate for capitalist valorization. And I think that this can be seen both in the features of the commodity. So for instance, like the fact that it records energy from the past into the future, that it allows like it's highly transportable. It is also like easily standardizable in a lot of ways. So like these and it's particularly after you have electricity, it becomes like the intensity of it can be even more like finely tuned, and so on and so forth, as a mechanism of transmission. But also you have the fact that like if you look at from the perspective of valorization, you have the fact that oil is actually like it's a highly monopolistic industry, like right from the outset. Like the power for setting prices is huge, and the fact that like if you look at more contemporary iterations, the fact that the prices are set mostly in exclusive future markets, and that there are all sorts of like financial assets linked to that price, and all sorts of concentration of that like that come from there. I think it would be sort of like this, what they argue is that this prevalence of fossil fuels is actually like given this over adequation of that particular commodity to the capitalist system, and like the attachment to fossil fuels comes from that also, like from the difficulty of an economic transition, like an energetic transition economically, also comes from that particular affinity between combustion and valorization, if you will. Gabriel?
You know, I think this formula that he proposes here, these three arrows here, I mean, it reminds me so much what Dennis was presenting last time. Actually, which is, I mean, we're not discussing with Simondon, but it's actually where we have a counter theory to propose, right? Because, you know, Simondon is also famous for being a guy who associates technology with scale, right? He's one of the very few philosophers who deals with issues of scale in like post-war philosophy and so on. And why am I saying this? Because, you know, I think we have the means today to show why this formula is grammatically incorrect for commodity logic, because CO2 is not commodity. If it was carbon credit, it could be written there, but that CO2 doesn't exist for commodities. It exists for us, right? I feel like, and this is something I really wanted to hear you comment about, because I know, like from reading your work, I had the impression that you found in media theorists people who are willing to look at technologies as a dynamic, mediative kind of form of material organization, and who take that seriously. But my impression is that the difference between media theory and critique of political economy is that media theory is too powerful, meaning there is no restraints on the theory to what relations you can count and what relations don't count. So if things are connected to things that are connected to things, if mediations have mediations that have mediations, it's fine. You can count all of them. You know, you can talk about how machines are using fossil fuel, which connects us to the dinosaurs, which connects us to the earth, which connects us to, you know, because there's no prescription in the theory where to stop. All differences make a difference. No wonder that are all Deleuzians at some point, right? That's, I mean, nobody's perfect. And why and where do I think that we are making, like, we have been working on something that is, let's say, moving in the same direction, but at the same time adding some restraints. It's a weaker theory or a more restricted one, which is exactly what Dennis was talking about last time when we were trying to show that, you know, the logic of value can be translated in kind of typed theoretic approach. What it means is that, you know, you can only consider certain things inputs and outputs if it can be formed into acceptable types, right? Which is what we were previously calling resolutions, right? There are resolutions at which things count and resolutions at which things don't count. There are differences that make a difference and differences that don't make a difference, right? I mean, I think that it's nice to see that we can actually kind of qualify what we've been doing in opposition to this other approach, exactly in this sense that we're not only interested in things that make a difference or on differences, but on the distinction between those that make a difference to the system and those that don't, right? There's a boundary there. And I think that it's a good example here because, for example, you listed a bunch of qualities of the material of fossil fuel that fits the type of money: infinite homogeneity, durability. You know, it's black gold for a reason, right? It embodies materially some abstract qualities that don't exist, in fact, right? But not everything about it embodies those characteristics, just as not everything about gold embodied the characteristics of the universal equivalent. But as far as it embodies those things, the things that don't make a difference about it disappear, right? Why am I saying this? Because I feel sometimes that I really wanted to hear what you think about this, that people who want to make analysis, ecological analysis of capitalism, they're stuck because they need to account for the relation between value and an ecosystem. They need a point of view where you can account for how value is making a difference in the world, like the metabolic point of view, how social things are changing material things, which are driving social things, and so on and so forth, and both things all at the same time. But that's not the point of view of commodity, right? And you wouldn't, if you want to account for the political economy of fossil fuel, you need to do two things. You need to have a richer system where I can track the connections. And I need to account for the fact of why those connections don't appear for a commodity, right? I mean, no wonder that this is the only way to explain why, you know, energy economists and ecological capitalists are panicking over the fact that they personally can see things that make a difference to the planet, but they cannot put it in a language that is compatible with the commodity world. Right? I mean, they're trying all sort of attempts to turn exteriorities into something that makes a difference to prices, right? And they're struggling. So sometimes I feel like some metaphysics is necessary to make all of that into the same system, like the same theory that provides this longer thread of differences that includes fossil fuel, geology, deep time, and commodities. We almost need to assume that it is also the framework that is driving the system itself, but it's not. So this is a really good example. I mean, this part here, what difference does this make to anything? Like in this system, it makes a difference to us being able to breathe, right? But let's say that in between this and the labor here who wouldn't be able to breathe anymore, right? We come up with a mask, and now I can breathe even though the CO level went up. Fine. I mean, business as usual, right? Yeah. So because now there is something embodied, which is the mask, that is actually going to make a difference on account of the CO being higher and the pollution being higher, and now it fell into the system. So I think that there is this is where I think the thing you did in the atlas with the modes with the logics really helps, because one thing is to treat mediations as technical objects, which is very convincing in terms of the material aspect. Like here, this is a material thing that is doing this thing. So the discussion suddenly can unfold. But it's harder to account from that standpoint all the things that are logically indifferent to the mediations, right? Michael is asking what we're calling type, but it's just at last meeting, Dennis was saying, using this mathematical theory, which is very useful in computation. I think the way that I naively understand a type is the sort of element that counts for some logical system, right? Dennis probably can make a better definition. I just like it. Sorry. Yeah, what sort of differences count, right? So I think that's really useful because it takes trouble. It takes some forming to turn a difference into a difference that commodities relate to. They don't relate to all differences, right? That's where I think cybernetics is limited, because it's not really interested in how differences come to make a difference. It's just interested that they do. And then everything is a machine, and then you can kind of differentiate your way through every difference, right? So there is something in this little moment there. Like clearly I know what he wants to do. Like, look at this added relation that we're not seeing that ties this whole process to the material basis, right? But how do you write it into the same logic? I probably would have to rewrite all the terms, you know, to make it grammatically correct.
Yeah, perhaps the question, like, I think that what we get at when we look at this type of formulation from Malm, for instance, if we look at it from the perspective of Saito's work, for example, which is like what he's doing here is that he's actually just merely like reproducing the material aspect into the formal. So like he's tracing the same type of connection in which he's tracing between like the metabolism of forms within that metabolism. And like for another one, so at least there should be, like, in terms of notation, there should be like a different like a different way, like a sort of like a different way of representing it. And this is I think that this is the problem of like most of the people, and this is something that I really want to tackle like for the future, and I was thinking about suggesting also, because I really think that these people that work on energy economics, like that I mentioned in the beginning, like there is a bad strain of it, but there's a very interesting strain of it, which is the interest that comes from, for instance, like models that try to wrap together like some of these questions. So for instance, like the flow fund model by Nicolau Georgescu, and it would be an example of something that tries to work within these two levels. And while it doesn't like, it might not be like, it doesn't address the question of logic directly, it might give some sort of like mileage for us to actually look at it and say, okay, like this is how we could represent it in like within the framework that we use. Because I think like I totally agree with you. I didn't even like I didn't even realize that like when I put this diagram, for instance, I was just like, yeah, sure, let's just like put the CO2 thing over there. But now that you say, it makes total sense, because it's the same type of like, it's the and this is also important because Saito is the only one that is actually dead set on that difference between like the formal metabolism and the material metabolism, because the rest of the ecological like the monthly review people, they are not really like, they have that interest, but it's not really something that like for them is like, I don't know, make it or break it, you know. For Saito it is like, he's the person that puts this in the system for that reason, I think. And like I totally agree that it's a difference that makes a difference in that sense also. Like I really think it should be something that we try to like venture in like more closely. And
yeah, it seems like it's an idea of something like organic metabolism, right? It's like being treated to each organ in the sense of like almost like Badiou's organs, not necessarily like the ventral ones, but in the sense of
because, you know,
a
like
section that does something.
Yeah, like, you know, where this could lead us, like, you know, you could have a more general theory of technology, which, you know, following Simondon's very definition, that technology is techniques plus scaling. Like it has to do with fixing resolutions in matter that we cannot directly fix, right? So we don't call technology if you're, you know, hitting a hammer on something, but, you know, if you can, you know, push an atom, you cannot push an atom, only through the machine you can. So in that sense, it's technological, not just technical, right? There is some added kind of resolution of information. A new type is introduced, right? It's only real for the machine, not for me, right? So we could come up with a kind of a general theory where you can talk about something that Simondon is interested also, like why is magic a technology? Why is, well, because the logic of mode A makes what's relevant in material reality, you know, of a certain type rather than another. Why are, you know, social technologies in states, you know, large agricultural processes built of people, not of complex machines sometimes, right? Well, because logically types are fixed in a certain way, therefore the complexes of matter and social will be in a different way. Like we can actually generalize out of media theory to a broader theory, you know? Yeah. And then you can ask, what sort of social material organization is structured, composed in such a way that ecological differences make a difference for it, right? It is already processed, already structured in such a way that writing CO2 there is in its own grammar. It's not a foreign language, right?
Yeah, totally. I really think that like we should yeah, I've been thinking about this about these types of things actually, because like the problem, as you said, like the problem with media theory is precisely this, like it particularly, and I only take like a small slice of it, which I think it's far more like, it's far different from the rest of it, which is like the Marxist media theory, like particularly that particular small niche. And yeah, this thing that Michael is saying actually, because like I use like when I talk about the work energy nexus, which would be like the relationship between the usage of energy and like the a sort of shift within the labor market. There is like, I know that the collective that I draw on, which is the Midnight Collective, is also like by like Federici was a part of it, so she has like a lot of points about like how the shifting for like the after So like how you can connect the energy crisis of 74, the Volcker shock, and the migration for the service economy with with a different matrix of unpaid domestic labor. So I think that there's definitely a lot of relationships that can be traced with that, and particularly like with the way that the service sector is actually like this sort of like the sector that comes to replace the woman the woman role in a lot of ways after she joins the labor market. So I think it definitely has a good relation about it. And but yeah, I'll try to like just get to that like really briefly, and then just open for for discussion, because I feel like I'm talking a lot and far more than I should. But yeah, and the second thing would be, so the scaling of the, like when we were talking about the industrial machine as that which relays between energy and information, there is a particular thing to be noted in terms of information transmission, which is about like what Simondon talks about, like information networks and networks of energy distribution, and how sort of like information networks pave the way for, like energy networks pave the way for information networks, which is when he says that like electric energy is at the same time information and energy. On the one hand, it can be indefinitely pared down without a loss of productivity. On the other hand, the very standardization of the conditions of energy production, which allows for an interconnection and normalized distribution, turns this energy into the carrier of information. One can ask the alternative network to make function as the source of energy a watch whose workings it regulates as a carrier of information. The simultaneous usage is concretized in the synchronic motor. So this is also something that allows not only for better transmission, but also for better devices, right? Because it's what Simondon calls, I think, I forgot how he calls, but he has all this weird language for stuff, but like it's that thing of like the transmission of some particular objects, like of parts of particular objects for other technical objects. Yeah, and the third thing would be like the relationship between the algorithm and labor mainly. And so Pasquinelli is interested in talking about algorithms as having a quality of emergence within the labor process, which is why he uses a very particular concept of what an algorithm is. And he talks about like the algorithm as through these four things. So basically, the algorithm is an abstract diagram that emerges from the repetition of a process and organization of time, space, labor, and operations. And it is not a rule that is invented from above, but emerges from below, which connects to how he pictures the collective worker that I spoke about like before. And the algorithm is the division of this process into finite steps in order to perform and control it efficiently. An algorithm is a solution to a problem, an invention that bootstraps beyond the constraints of the situation. And it is a trick, and that like the sense of trick that he uses is a trick in terms of like it's a shifting away of labor from the view of people. And fourth, most importantly, an algorithm is an economic process, as it must employ the least amount of resources in terms of space, time, and energy, adapting to the limits of the situation. And of course, here, like if you think about what we have been discussing about. Like it doesn't seem like this economy of their algorithm doesn't become clear, but it is an economy that is inscribed within the space of valorization. And like valorization is the grammar of the algorithmic economy for like of the shape of what economic means for an algorithm within capitalism, at least for Pasquinelli. Like it's the capacity of produce value with least amount of like resources, which does not see in a way like the rest of like the metabolic, the rest of the metabolic imprint that it really causes. And yeah, so mainly like Pasquinelli bases his work and on a operaist sociologist who's called Romano Alquati. I highly recommend the works. It's really good. And but what he synthesizes is that like Alquati does an ethnographic work in a factory. It's the Olivetti factory, which is also like one of the first, like it's a factory for office supplies. Like you can find some, like there was a factory of them in Brazil also. You can find some like old stuff and antiquaries in this type of place. But mainly for him, for Pasquinelli, actually, what is important about like Alquati's account of the way in which this factory was the first one to implement a sort of like cybernetic management on like around the 50s, the Olivetti factory in Italy. is the fact that labor served as a source of information for an industrial apparatus and was the most valuable part of the labor was the tracking and the formalization of these micro gestures. And I think I have to admit Gabrielle back again. Yeah. Okay. And the second would be that the information machine, and here we already talk about the second paradigmatic machine of the system, which would be the Turing machine, is crossed and operated by flows of valorizing information. And this is the concept that he coins for it. So it's that are produced by workers and gradually improve the design of the machine. So actually the skill, like the algorithm emerges from the labor process and from the collective worker in what he's talking about. And of course it is processed, like that data is processed by a particular type of intellectual labor, but still like it has this indirect quality of like shifting of like constant formalization and like reconstruction of the form of the process. And third, it is the numeric dimension of digital information that makes it possible to translate knowledge into information, information into numbers, and numbers into value. And fourth, the cybernetic apparatus of the factory grows and improves thanks to the contribution of the workers' socialized intelligence. So you can actually track and quantify small pieces of action into both a better design for the machines and also a better layout for the factory and a better policy of management for the people. And I'll actually go to this. And what he talks about actually, like, because if you see, there is a pattern to what I'm talking about. So you have first a paradigm of like a new relay into a paradigmatic machine, which is energy and information. And then you have like a scale, a shift in scale or through electricity. And then you have what like the Turing machine, which splits also another relay, which splits mainly like data and metadata, which is like, and this spread becomes important and becomes utilized particularly to another like widespread circuit, which is what Pasquinelli calls planetary computation. And what he calls that planetary computation can do, and this is something that comes, it's particularly like after the utopian imaginaries of the network in the 90s and so on, is that the meta-analysis of data, so mapping and interpreting their patterns, trends, and forecasting their tendencies, and not their brute accumulation that makes data sets meaningful and valuable. If the network society was a space of flows that was based on the horizontal exchange of electronic information, data centers incarnate the vertical accumulation of information about information, metadata. And metadata represent a shift to a different and higher dimensional scale in relation to information. They disclose the collective and political nature that is intrinsic to all information. And yeah, just to go a little bit like on, like if you note that this particularly takes place after the 90s, and what I was talking with when I spoke to Michael on the chat about the work energy nexus, and this is a very, like, it's something that is verified on the Midnight Collective energy, I think it's called Energy Crisis Apocalypse, something like that. And yeah, what it does mainly, like the argument that they make, that's 78, it's not 68, but the argument that they make is that actually like both the Volcker shock in terms of like the shifting of the financial paradigm away from the gold standard, and also the oil prices are parts of a new economic paradigm, which is also like, which becomes more enabled by the spread of information through the split that we talked about. So mainly what we have here is that like through the energy sector, you have like, and during that period after the Gulf War, you have actually what is a different concentration of profits, like massively different in the energy sector, which is a sector that is both highly like qualified and also highly automated. So when you have that different split, which also happens like occasionally during the same time in which there are having proletarian movements within both the global South and the global North, that restructuring it, and both to have the two axes of capitalist valorization to be like inflected into the energy sector and also to like highly monopolized industries in general. And also on the finance sector means like it's particularly imbricated within a shift for the service sector as being the main place of employment for people. And if you talk about like the statistics, like high income countries, there is a tendency of like 60% in the creation of like non-standard jobs. between the 90s and from now. And in low-income countries, like you have the service sectors like applying, like being responsible for sustaining most of the wage relation into it. And I think this has a.
What do you mean by non-standard jobs here? Does that include service, or is it also like?
They are talking like here on like on that report in particular, what they're taking as like non-standard jobs. They're talking about like service, particularly service gig. Like it's a very sub niche to what they're talking about, if I'm not mistaken. So they're talking about like irregular service work there, and it, like on that statistics about the global South countries, they're talking about like service work in general. I think it's like around like from 60 to 80% between these countries. Like the percentage of employment that is actually in the service sector. And of course, like the promise of the service sector is that this is going to become a society of engineers or whatever, but it only becomes like a society of, you know, like I want to say a lot of like Brazilian things, but mainly like small barber shops, small people selling like food, small people working with like orders, like also gig workers, and also like app delivery, bolo de pote, tapioca, whatever, like whatever kind of small commerces that also become a way of like getting into that service sector, and not really like the beautiful dream of a fully intellectual economy or whatever. So that leaves us with this completely manic thing, which is like what was developed in my chapter 2, which is to talk about, like we were talking about, two transmission transitions, which would be like electricity and the internet. And we're talking about like a shift on the thermodynamic machine, and then the Turing machine, and then planetary computation as something that like informs this new type of like society. The concepts we're talking about here, like electricity allows for valorizing information, and like the thermodynamic machine allows for energy and information to be separated. And then through the internet and like communication, you have a new relay to be finally affected on the Turing machine already, which is the relay between data and metadata, and whose intensification calls upon the planetary computation thing. And then of course you have like the fact that these are like embedded within like proto-cybernetics and cybernetics. Then you can also map these into, like, if you want to be really playful with it, you can map it into like things like disciplinary society. So if you look at the model of like Bentham's panopticon, you have that. This was something fun that I found out, that actually like the layout of the design of the diagram that is the panopticon is actually comes from a factory in Bentham's trip to Belarus. So it's a fun thing.
I was wondering when you said the Belarusian factory, what my people have to do with the
it really doesn't give away. I like to keep the suspense until the end. But and the second thing would be like the Al-Qadi factory was, of course, like this sort of like microcosm of what could be a control society that could serve as a sort of a diagram. And the metadata society is what Pasquinelli allocates as the launching of the Cage, Google's database, and also like the spread of databases, which is also something that is particularly like that reproduces what we already know as like the global South divide. So for instance, if you have like, there is a concentration of databases, not only that is sectoral, like if you think that like you have Nenex database, which is like related to like financial capital, has 20 times the size of like the databases of NASA, for instance, like for processing that beautiful money. And like the spread and the division of these like are highly embedded within what we would call the International Division of Labor. And yeah, that's it. I'm so sorry it took so much time, and thanks everybody. Like, I'm not gonna do the recap. I think that's the vibe. And yeah, thank you guys very much.
Thank you. The last point with disciplinary society, control society, and metadata society is very similar to what the way what Byung-Chul Han breaks up the societies. But then his third one is what, that like entrepreneurial or something like that society. It's interesting how like that's more emphasis on like, I guess, the psychic state of the individual, right? Rather than like, this is more like, I guess, productive from the spirit production, right?
Yeah, I have this thing, like one of the things that actually, like one of the things that is, I think, in the blueprint of how I plan to write my when I was writing my thesis was the fact that I wanted to actually take a standpoint that was not the standpoint of the theory, like the contemporary theory about capitalism that I had within my area of knowledge in particular, which was the standpoint of neoliberalism. It was always like the standpoint of like a set of doctrines. It's either a set of like economic doctrines actualized by states, or a set of like psychic doctrines that get into the mindset of the people and like this type of stuff. And this was one of the things that like it gets to similar conclusions. It gets to similar conclusions, but I think that there is also an important difference, is that I think that like we have to think about the material support to which that type of consciousness emerges. Like and I think that looking at the technological diagram can actually like give you a better idea of like how that particular like form of consciousness emerges within like that sort of like image of the self emerges rather than something. And yeah, but I really think that like if you think about like metadata and individuality, how it does, I didn't have time to talk about like culture in there, but I think that there is a good point on the relationship between culture and data, and the relay between data and metadata. There's a good book about it by Hiroki Azuma. It's called Otaku, Japan's Database Animals. And it's a really good book like about how culture becomes actually like framed by the database, and there is a sort of like a splintering of narrative, like there's not like narratives no longer important on like cultural objects, because and the reference to like a great narrative or like a grand narrative within, it's utterly like it becomes deflated for what is actually what he calls the logic of the database, which is like the features of each of the characters get lined up and recombined into a particular plot, in which the plot is less and less relevant, and like the features as consumption features are more and more like more and more over there as the main target of creation as such. Like it's about like more of a combination than actually like of a reference to a narrative X or Y. And it, I mean, if you've watched like, let's say Scandinavian detective shows on Netflix, they all have like the like the plot is very similar in a lot of ways, and like the features of the characters, and like you can see that type of like database within culture in a way, in ways that I find really productive for thinking about it, like and it's something that Azuma traces to like otaku culture, which I think it's a really nice work. Michael's talking about like service sector. Yeah, I mean it's definitely like I think it's a highly servitude sector that gets sold as intellectual sector because it has intellectual like tasks on it. But there is also the like, even for the biggest like intellectual tasks, you can see like when I think Federici talks about this, a lot of like the tasks that are done by highly qualified people were actually tasks that were not taken away, but like that migrated from what was previously like reproductive labor, like house labor, and then that they got actually over there, but then that women actually get the servile like to rehearse what they usually like what they already do at home at a wage for like a much larger, like a much lesser, like being rewarded much less than they actually were. And but yeah, totally, I think that it becomes like the, and also the proliferation of services as such, right? Because some of the services are really unthinkable from before, like the fact that you could, like that delivery, for instance, it's a delivery just for drinks that we have in Brazil. Like it's really, it's almost like all of the time it's not worth for you to actually like buy beer at a supermarket. You can just like order it, and it comes colder than it will ever get in your fridge, and you better drink it fast, you know, because like it's crazy, like how well it works, like for this. I'm very amazed at like how these new utilities become like, and also like internet, for instance, that in which you can sell like there is a service economy in the internet that is sort of like a high grade one. So for example, like if you're a web developer and you speak English, you can be like a freelancer to do like very simple work for very high fees. like very, very, very high. But if you like, and but there is also like, if you're not a developer, if you don't have like the good developer skills, and but you speak English and you have a stable internet connection, you can do click work. Like I have done this like during college, for instance. Like you can just go, like you can sign in to like the Appen, for instance, is one of these companies, and you just do like work of like training algorithms to recognize, for instance, like specific images, or being able to look at like a Facebook page and see what kind of location it is, if it's like a, I don't know, a shop, or if it's a public space, or if it's like to get it to like to train their own categorization engine. Then of course you're unemploying yourself. But that's fine. Like you get to make like a few cents per question that you respond in dollars, which, like, depending on where you're from, it's a lot. Like and everything, I didn't know about that. That's insane. Like what do you mean everything from the supermarket? Like a like you do a month worth of shopping and it gets to you in 10 minutes?
I'm gonna say it. You know, if you're cooking, you're making some pasta and you have no tomato sauce, you can just ask and they bring you in 10 minutes at the maximum, because it's like you pay a little bit more for that, but it's really express. You know, they search for the nearby supermarkets and send it to you, but it's 10 minutes. Why do you need something that bring you whatever in 10 minutes, man? This is crazy. You
Just
can
turn
cross the fucking road and buy it, but you have some guy to bring it in your home, in your door. And I think it's crazy. That is, it's what I'm saying. I think it's servile in this sense, you know, because you have to be really privileged to have these people at your disposal all the time, you know.
Yeah, totally. But it also becomes like democratized in a way. If you look at like these free gig apps and like the sort of platform infrastructure, like there are people to reach. Like this makes absolutely no difference, right? Like if you're between the hyper rich, like you're not gonna get an Uber. You have like I don't know, if you're a character from Succession, you have your own limo company to like drive you from one place to the other. So like when the peasant
Yeah, I know, but you know, you load the bar. How,
you get the
all the time, and you have to have these multitude of people much and much more explore to you to make it work, you know. That it's
if your
crazy.
servant is a freelancer, you can get like 10 servants a day, like each one bit by bit, instead of just like having 10 empires take care of your house. But yeah, I think this is a huge thing, like for people, because it like it becomes really a service that like it becomes increasingly difficult for like a public sector to provide like these types of services. Like, and it becomes like a harder and harder bargain for actually, like, of course you have, I don't know, particularly like apps for like delivery and stuff that are being like happening right now with like cooperatives, and also like you have cities that are actually passing this projects through the city hall, and like it seems that the state intervenes a little bit like in terms of these services for actually like if it cannot regulate them, right? Which is like if you regulate them, they just leave, and apparently like in a lot of places. But yeah, I definitely like I think it becomes a sort of like a hot mess after a little bit, because then it just like you just roll a lot of services, and then the services that are predicated in like all sorts of like precarious arrangements then become sort of essential for a lot of the people. Like they don't know how to live without them like anymore. Like I don't know, even like taking like banal stuff, like I don't know, going somewhere like people getting back from nightclubs, it kills the vibe of like, yeah, let's wait for the subway while I'm extremely drunk. with a bunch of people around, for example. Like, it really kills that beautiful experience. It just like at the end, it's just like a very bad thing in a way. Like, and also because of course all the workers in it are thoroughly fucked, like by being over there. But it also offers, it's a much better, like it's a much better pay, and I'm really like, it's a much better pay than maybe working some of the on some sectors of the service sector. Like if you get hired even for like to work at a bakery, for example. Like I was looking at some like announcements that were, and like it was like one minimum wage. You make more of it as like definitely, if you know how to ride a motorcycle, you're gonna prefer to do that. Like you're gonna prefer to be in delivery app rather than just working at a bakery. And because you win more money, like working at the delivery app, both because you can work more hours and also because like you get to be your own boss, you get to win like this sort of like those special rates also for the commission. Like you really, like it's not like these people, they are like it's actually for a lot of the workers, it seems like an alternative to navigate very shitty service work. Like
it's related to this whole like entrepreneur of the self type concept,
Yeah.
right? It's like putting all of the I guess like managerial, besides like what the app deals with, right? To like tell you go here at this time, go here at this point. But like in terms of, for example, like if they're driving, the gas in the car, things like that are all put back onto them rather than like the company paying for it. So that is coming out of their paycheck. So rather than being an employee, they're like they're considered like a outside contractor or something like that. So that's, I mean, that's part of the how it makes it, even when they can get paid more, almost like more precarious, because there's like the lack of stability, and it's not always, it's right, like you're getting paid exactly by how much business you're getting individually or how many whatever deliveries you're doing rather than like how many hours you're working. So it can provide more freedom, but also it restricts people a lot. So
yeah, and all of these things are completely like, I don't know, if you think about Uber's business model, it's like a crime against like everything that is right. Like if you really look at the way in which like it really pushes a whole new market for cars, for instance, for like rental cars, for like purchase of particular models, and also like it generates a whole like other sets of crowdings within the city. And then you have like the same thing with motorcycles for the delivery apps, and all of these things like are all built together into these like they're all built together into that system, which is highly private, which is like a phone. And like all of the rest of the mechanics are actually provided by the owners of that. So like you have this, like you have at the same time, like it's like Marx's fucking nightmare. Like you have at the same time like work per piece, like earning like per piece of work actually, which is something that like also highly can diminish a lot like the condition of like the price of that. And you also have the like the sole ownership of the means of production, to use a very old concept, by those same people that actually like use it and like capitalize on it, with no type of like string attached to regulation or anything. It's just
yeah, the people own the entire means of production of that, right, that service, except for like the very minimal connective part, which is right the digital aspect.
Yeah.
But then like all of the exploitation can still happen through that, right? Because ultimately the app is the one setting the prices.
Yeah, and also the thing with the, like in Brazil, for instance, we have this sort of like intermediary between the app and the worker, which starts like blossoming, especially in bigger cities, because the main interest of the company, like of iFood and of Uber Eats is gone from Brazil now, but like of iFood and Uber and like this type of things, is that actually like you have a full like, because it's so set on like the supply and demand formula for like setting the prices, like you have to have a full supply at all times, otherwise your service is shit. Like if you go to the app and you cannot find a driver within like a reasonable amount of time, your service sucks. Like as a service provider, you would get replaced for like reliable local alternatives. But the thing, like what they do in like here, we have the logistical operators, which are basically like people that intermediate this relationship. They give some sort of like institutional framework for the app worker. And like in terms of you have a time which you have to be there, like you have, and they sort of intermediate that relationship. Like they can provide you with like a rental car, for instance, but then you get even like a smaller share of what you actually earn from that. They can provide you a number of like facilities within the work journey, so that
this is separate. This is separate from the what the digital whether provider like iFood or whatever Uber Eats.
I don't know
the
how
intermediary.
I don't know how they actually like work. I know that there is like, at least from the people that like a friend with here, Renzo could explain this better because I'm sure he knows. But I know from the people that work with this thing that there is like there is definitely a connection between like the offices of the companies in like the bigger cities, so like the headquarters of like the national iFood in Brazil, and these small logistical operators to ensure supply. So they have this contact, but I'm not sure how this is built into the infrastructure of the app. If there is something like that allows like this cut of the like to be taken directly, or if this is something like a sort of an informal like a formal contract that happens like sideways from that. But I know that like the iFood companies know about this and they encourage it as something to like make sure that there is a supply of people to actually take the orders. I think I'm gonna pause the recording and also like